which is not saying much, but saying enough. All right. Now, what I'm going to do this morning is I want to give you some background on the setting of Daniel. So we will actually start chapter 1 next week. And I think it's really important, if you're going to understand the book of Daniel, to understand where the book of Daniel occurs in the history of the Old Testament, in the history of the nation of Israel, and actually in the history of the world. Daniel is written at a pivotal time in the history of the entire Western world. And so I want to talk about that. And we're going to see that Daniel kind of automatically breaks up into 3 sections. We've got chapter 1, which we'll cover next week, which is Daniel's personal story of how he ended up in the court of Nebuchadnezzar in the capital city of the Babylonian Empire, in Babylon. And it's a wonderful story and very encouraging. But then beginning in chapter 2, we're going to have 6 chapters that disclose all the history of the non-Jewish nations in the world. We're going to get an overview of the principal events in all of history, and there's actually revelation that continues right down to the present day. In chapter 2, we will be able to see our current situation predicted in this case, about probably about 600 BC, so 2,600 years ago. It's a remarkable prophecy. This will end, this section will end shortly after the fall of Babylon and continue into the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and Darius the Mede. Interestingly, chapter 1 is written in Hebrew. Chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic. And it turns out that they're written in a form of Aramaic referred to as Imperial Aramaic, or you might call it High Aramaic. And then after covering the history of the Gentile nations in these chapters written in Imperial Aramaic, the writer goes back to Hebrew and covers the plan for Israel, which includes a prediction of when the Messiah will come, when the Messiah will be cut off, and when the Messiah will come to reign. So those are all included. In these chapters, we're going to meet for the first time in biblical history the Antichrist. And we're going to learn some of the key characteristics of the Antichrist. But all of those things are exciting and really fun to study. But it's also important to recognize that the key theme in Daniel is that God is always in control. Your capital city may have been demolished by a horde of barbarians, pagans. Your temple may have been burned to the ground. Your people taken captive and forcefully transported to another location. And yet God is still sovereign. And God's plan for you, for your nation, and for mankind is still in play. God doesn't have a plan B. That's what Daniel's going to tell us. So it's important to remember that no matter how dire the news, whether it's personal or national, God has a plan, and that plan is on schedule. So 3 major portions of Daniel: Daniel's personal history, how he got to Babylon, the plan for the Gentile nations, and then the plan for Israel. Now, if we skim through Daniel, and Daniel's pretty short, I mean, you can read through it pretty easily in one sitting, and I'd recommend you do that, just so you'll have the whole book in mind. Among the highlights, we're going to see Daniel's personal integrity and God's protection of Daniel. We'll see that especially in chapters 1 and 6. Then a famous episode that is often part of your children's Sunday school teaching is Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue, which reveals the 4 great Gentile empires. Right. So we'll talk more about those when we get there. Then we have the incident with the fiery furnace. And who gets thrown into the furnace? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then a 4th person appears in the fiery furnace, one like a son of the gods, walking around in the fiery furnace. We'll even, I'm sure we can come up with a picture of the type of furnaces that were used at that time as brick kilns. Chapter 4, we're going to see the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar, great Gentile king, brought to the point of acknowledging the sovereignty of God in his life and in the life of the nations. We get to see the writing on the wall. And when you say he could see the writing on the wall, well, this is the chapter of the Bible where that's saying the writing on the wall, where that came from. We see Daniel in the lion's den and plots by political enemies to destroy a person of integrity. We're going to meet this person of the Antichrist for the first time in Scripture, the little horn. And he's actually going to appear in several different chapters, both chapter 7 and chapter 11. We're also going to see a vision of the Ancient of Days and one like a son of man. And this is a title that Jesus takes upon himself. And in chapter 7, we will see the Son of Man receiving authority over all the earth from the Ancient of Days and coming on the clouds of glory. And Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And when he's questioned by the high priest who asked him if he is the Messiah, he says, "Yes, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory." He's quoting from Daniel chapter 7. So Jesus at his trial takes on himself the title given to the one who is to rule the whole world in Daniel chapter 7. Then in chapter 9, we're going to see the prophecy of the 70 weeks. This gives us the timeline for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, for the coming of the Messiah, for the fall of the Messiah, and for the return of the Messiah and the restoration of the nation of Israel. And we'll see that in chapter 9. We're going to get more details about the Antichrist and the abomination which makes desolate. This phrase occurs in Daniel, and it is repeated by Christ on the Mount of Olives. You remember when Jesus and the disciples were leaving the temple, and one of the disciples pointed out to Jesus how fantastic the architecture was and what great stones had been used to build it. And Jesus' response was, "A day is coming when not one of these stones will be left set on another." And when the disciples ask him when this is going to occur and what will be the sign of his coming, he refers to the abomination of desolation. Once again, quoting from the book of Daniel. And we'll put that in context. And then we're going to see the first reference to the Great Tribulation, the 3.5-year period, which decimates the whole world, but especially decimates the nation of Israel. We learn from Zechariah, for example, that 2 out of 3 Jews in Israel perish by the end of the Great Tribulation. So, but the third that remains is a believing third. And so between chapter 9 and chapter 12, we actually get the timeline for the book of Revelation. So you can't really understand the book of Revelation until you understand the book of Daniel. So it is a prerequisite to reading Revelation and understanding it that you study the book of Daniel. So by the time we get to the end of Daniel, you'll be ready to pick up Revelation and just read right through it. So.
So is that our next study?
We'll see when we get there. So one of the important aspects of Daniel is that Daniel is going to foresee the ultimate, complete, total victory of God in this world. Not in the next world, but in this world. God will have a complete victory. And every time I think about that, I think of the Lord's Prayer. Remember how that starts? How does it start? Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Right? On earth as thy will be done on earth. God hasn't fully answered that prayer yet. We actually see in the book of Revelation that prayer being offered up to God from the incense censer. And God answers that prayer in the book of Revelation. And God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God is going to see that. So Daniel is going to outline for us the rise and the fall of 4 Gentile kingdoms that dominate the world until the return of Christ, from the fall of Jerusalem to the return of Christ, which assures us, as we see these prophecies fulfilled through history, even right down to the present day, it gives us an assurance that God keeps his promises and that God's prophecies are fulfilled literally. They're literally fulfilled. In the life of Daniel, we're going to see that believers can function in integrity, with integrity, in a godless society. All right. So it's important for us to remember that Babylon is a pagan Gentile nation. At least at the beginning and through most of his career, Daniel is not serving under believers. He's serving under unbelievers. And yet he maintains his faithfulness to God and his integrity. We're going to see Christ's future role as ruler of all. Any questions before I move on here? It's a wonderful book, and you'll be tremendously encouraged as you go through it. So, all right. So within biblical history, Daniel occurs at a pivotal point where there is a state change in God's relationship to the nation of Israel. So if you go back to Genesis, when Abraham was still Abram, living in the land of Ur, God appeared to him and promised him that he would make of Abraham a great nation, and that all the peoples of the world would be blessed through his descendants. And so that a great nation would arise from the descendants, and that the whole world would be blessed through them, all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 49, we see a promise. We see a prophecy made by Jacob about his son Judah, that all the peoples of the world would be subject to a king who would arise from among Judah's descendants. You go look at Genesis 49, 9 and 10, and even in the prophecies of Balaam in Numbers, there's a prophecy of a king who will arise from Judah, through whom all the nations of the world would submit. That's an unfulfilled promise, right? We don't see all the nations of the world in submission to Christ at the present time. But that prophecy was made and reiterated. At Mount Sinai, God promised Israel that he would bless them above all the peoples if they kept his covenant. Every time I see that passage, God says, if you keep all that I command you, I will bless you above all the peoples of the earth. And then the next verse always makes Joyce laugh. And the people said, we'll do it. We can do that. Sure. No problem. It sounds like a great deal. And they failed miserably, right? Now, later, God promises to King David that his descendant would rule forever on Israel's throne. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The centrality of this promise in the history of Israel is reviewed in great detail in Psalm 89. In fact, Psalm 89 is a psalm of complaint. And Psalm 89 complains to God, you said to David he would never lack a man on the throne of Israel. It's not happening. Why are you waiting so long, God? Why aren't you fulfilling your promise? And Daniel's going to answer that question. So if you read the first chapter of the book of Isaiah, it is a legal indictment of the nation of Israel, where Isaiah goes through the record of their violation of the conditions of the covenant, and then promises Israel that the penalty clause in the Mosaic covenant for the nation of Israel is about to be executed. And you can read about that penalty clause in Deuteronomy 28. Probably a good idea not to do that right before you eat. So some passages in there will turn your stomach. There's a gruesome promise of punishment for failure to keep the covenant. And combine this with Isaiah 1, where they are convicted in God's court, calling the heavens and the earth as witnesses for their violation of the covenant. It explains why Israel is captive in Babylon at that time. So in 2 Kings, God sends the nation of Assyria to remove the 10 northern tribes from the land promised to Abraham because of their disobedience and their going after foreign gods, specifically Baal or Baal. And then in 2 Kings 25, last chapter of 2 Kings, God sends the nation of Babylon to remove the remaining 2 southern tribes from the land promised to Abraham and to take them into captivity in Babylon. So Daniel is written starting from the period when Babylon destroyed Judah, and it answers the question of Psalm 89, how long, O Lord? Do you see the conflict here? From the perspective of the Jew at the time of Daniel, you've got the promise of punishment if they disobeyed, and that punishment clause has been executed by God because of the failure of the nation. On the other hand, you have God's promises to bless all the world through the descendants of Abraham, through a great nation that would arise from his seed, and the promise to David that he would never lack a man to rule on the throne of Israel. So there's a conflict. They've been denationed, they've been removed from the land, their capital's been destroyed, they're completely humiliated and under Gentile oppression, and yet God has made these promises. So how is God going to resolve the issue? How is God going to restore? How is God going to keep his promises? And Daniel reveals that. He reveals there'll be 4 Gentile empires that will continue down to the end of human history, when the last empire will be replaced by the kingdom of the Messiah, the promised one. the descendant of David. So a critical point in biblical history. So does anybody have a question at this point? Because I'm getting ready to change the topic a little bit. Anybody have a question about this? Anybody think of anything you want to add or get Greg?
Why did you just, okay, the promises God made were made, I may be confused when they were made, but it seems to me they were made contingent upon Israel obeying, which Israel didn't. So why is God just saying?
Just dumping them.
Promises no longer in effect because you didn't hold up your end.
Yeah, there are, there's actually 3 promises, 2 of which are unconditional and 1 of which is conditional. So the promise to Abraham for all the world to be blessed through a great nation that would rise from his seed, that's an unconditional promise. And there's an unconditional promise made to David. Promises made to David, yeah, so promises made to David that he would have a son on the throne of Israel forever. The conditional promise that's made to Israel is, you will be the nation through which I bless all the nations of the world if you keep my covenant. So that's the unconditional one. I'm sorry, that's the conditional one. The middle one that came through Moses, the Mosaic covenant, is conditional. Blessing is dependent upon obedience.
I thought even that one is eventually fulfilled.
It is.
Okay, even though
Yeah.
it's conditional and that fails, it's to be fulfilled.
Yeah, it's conditional in that receiving the blessings and being the nation through which all the nations of the world are blessed is conditional on their obedience. But then Moses goes on in the covenant and says, having said all this, I know you're going to fail, but after you fail, God will restore you. And when he restores you, then you will keep the covenant and then you will receive the blessing. And that part hadn't been fulfilled yet. And that's the part that with the Great Tribulation brings Israel back to faith in Christ. And the whole nation becomes believers by the end of the Great Tribulation. So that when Christ returns, he returns to a believing Israel. And that all of the promises in the Mosaic covenant are fulfilled during the millennial kingdom. So even the unconditional one, even the conditional one, God is going to make sure it's kept. Yes, sir.
A brief question.
Yeah.
Not exactly too far off.
Okay.
You mentioned Daniel 28. Not Daniel.
Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy 20. The penalty phase, and that's really striking. I mean, the
Oh, gosh.
body to the nation, to the fields, the enemies that are going to run over you. The thing is awesome. Now, my question has to do with the breadth of that application. Is it across timelines? Is it narrowed down to a timeline, from X number of years BC until X number of years after the death of Christ and the Caesar encounter? Can you get on that and clear my mind on that?
Yeah, I think it's an example of a double fulfillment. So there is an ultimate fulfillment of that dispersion to all the nations of the world that occurs in 70 AD after the betrayal of Christ by the nations. There is a preliminary fulfillment, kind of like a foreshadowing of the ultimate fulfillment at the time of Daniel. So penalty clauses are executed at the time of Daniel, and the nation gets dispersed among the nations of the Middle East, from Egypt to Babylon to Persia and Media. They are brought back partially restored, but they never return to true faith in God. And so there's a partial fulfillment of the restoration. Then after the crucifixion of Christ and their rejection of Christ as the Messiah, then you have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the complete dispersal of the nation to all the nations of the world, which continues right down to this day. So I think it's a dual fulfillment. And I think the current dispersal Jews around the world is still a manifestation of that failure to keep the Deuteronomic covenant. So I think there's a double fulfillment. And the complete fulfillment occurred in 70 AD. And the complete restoration will occur at the end of the Great Tribulation, when the whole nation comes to belief in Christ as the Messiah. All right. Yeah, Terry?
It's just, okay, maybe totally. In Luke, it talks about Jesus saying, you will not see my face until you say, blessed is the name of the one who comes in the name of the Lord.
Yes.
Then he goes into that talk about how I wanted to gather you up.
But you would not.
But you would not. Is he waiting to come back to fulfill that last promise until they are ready to receive him as their Lord?
That's right. So Christ will not return until the whole nation of Israel accepts Christ as their Messiah. And that will occur toward the end of the Great Tribulation.
It's interesting.
And it's amazing. You remember the Old Testament ends with the promise about Elijah? And before the coming of the Lord, I will send Elijah, and he will restore the hearts of the nation to God. So, and John the Baptist was a forerunner of that. So we see a partial fulfillment of that promise to send Elijah in the career of John the Baptist. There will be another John the Baptist type figure, one of the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. And under that person's ministry, Israel will be restored. So, and that's where we have the promise that they will look on him whom they pierced, and they'll be pierced in their hearts, knowing how much they have suffered through history for having refused to acknowledge Christ as the Messiah. Yeah, it's amazing.
Jeff, this is Keith. I had a question.
Yeah, Keith.
While you're doing this really fine job of setting all the context, would you address the authorship and the date and the occasion from your perspective in our churches, and then also how you will see the book relative to the millennium and also the taking of the believers up?
Okay. Yeah, now the rapture is not talked about in Daniel. And as a matter of fact, the millennial kingdom is not exegeted within the book of Daniel. To learn about the millennial kingdom, you're going to have to go to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel.
Okay.
Daniel deals with the period leading up to the establishment of the millennial kingdom. Now, the author of the book of Daniel is uncontestable for believers because Jesus says that Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. Jesus attributes it, Jesus refers to the prophet Daniel, and he says, as Daniel said, as Daniel spoke. Now, if you go on Wikipedia and look up the book of Daniel, what you're going to see is a confident statement that the book of Daniel was written about 150 BC, not 530 BC. That is based on the presupposition that prophecy is impossible. Since Daniel gives great details about the rise and fall of the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes and the rise of Alexander the Great, unbelievers look at the book of Daniel and say it's got to be a pious forgery. It cannot possibly have been written in 600 BC because those events hadn't occurred yet. But that's based on the presupposition that there's no such thing as prophecy. It's just something made up. So despite the evidence to the contrary, including the fact that Daniel is written in Imperial Aramaic, in chapters 2 through 7. It's just not possible for it to have been written at that time because we all know that prophecy is impossible, right?
It's interesting how often that argument is
Yeah.
used for authors or denial of authorship.
That's right.
Is that they can't conceive of miracles or prophecy as being true, so therefore it couldn't be, it always had to be after the fact.
There has to be another explanation
Yeah.
because we all
And
know
that's
that
the
miracles don't
humanistic
occur.
view of biblical content.
Yeah.
Coming into question.
So Jesus could not have predicted the destruction of Israel and the dismantling of the temple because prophecy is impossible. So somebody must have added that later. That's the only acceptable explanation. Because to accept that it is prophecy implies your worldview has got to change.
Why don't I believe it?
That's right. And then why don't you believe it? Yeah, Michael.
It also just kind of points out, which I think is pretty shocking, is how small or non-existent that makes God. If God can't make prophecy, he's a pretty tiny God.
Not much of a God, is he?
Shows that they don't believe
So when did you say it was written?
Some of it occurs, some of the events reported in the book occur in 536 BC. So I think most conservative authors, evangelical authors, believe it was completed no later than 530 BC, or no earlier than 530 BC. So sometime after Cyrus had issued the decree to allow the Jews to return to Jerusalem, which is 536 BC. All right. So it begins in 605 and ends by 530 BC. Now in world history, Daniel spans the period of what is called the Neo-Babylonian or the Chaldean Empire. And the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, is a multi-nation, multi-continent spanning empire. And we enter a new phase in human history with this empire. And between Babylon and Persia and Alexander the Great, we see the establishment of the bureaucracy necessary for administering a great multi-nation, multi-people empire. So there is a fundamental change in what the rest of history looks like, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar. And there's no question that Nebuchadnezzar was both a military and an administrative genius, followed by another military and administrative genius, Cyrus the Great. Nabopolassar was crowned king of Babylon in 626 BC. And the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, and remember the Assyrians are the one that carried away the 10 northern tribes in 758 BC. And Nabopolassar, together with allies that included the Medes and the Persians, overthrew the Assyrian capital of Nineveh in 612 BC. So the empire that had dominated the ancient Near East and was the rival of the Egyptian empire. This is part of what made living in Palestine such a nightmare. Assyrians coming from the north, Egyptians coming from the south, right? That great Assyrian empire was defeated by Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar. And then Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar pursued the fleeing Assyrian army, pursued them first to Haran, where he defeated them. And then the remnants of the Assyrian Empire withdrew to a place called Carchemish, where they planned to hook up with the Egyptian army, hopefully to defeat the rising power of the Babylonians. So in 605 BC, the remnants of the Assyrian army and the armies of Pharaoh Necho from Egypt had a great battle at the city of Carchemish, and Nebuchadnezzar thoroughly defeated the combined armies of the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and then pursued the fleeing Egyptian army down the coast, and which really the end, he really broke eliminated the Assyrians completely as a rival and broke the power of the Egyptians at this point. They hadn't completely defeated the Egyptians yet. So this was in 605. Now, as this battle was forming up, as the Egyptian army was coming up the coast to join up with the Assyrians at Carchemish, King Josiah of Israel brought his army out to try to stop the Egyptian army, and they met on the plains of Megiddo. And the Egyptians completely defeated Josiah's army, and they killed Josiah. And they also put one of Josiah's sons on the throne as a puppet king, subservient to Egypt. So then when Nebuchadnezzar comes charging down, chasing the Egyptians, he's defeated in Egypt by the Egyptians, and then on his way back, he replaces the Egyptian puppet with a Babylonian puppet. And at this point, he takes the sons and daughters of the nobility in the nation of Israel, takes them back as captives to Babylon as hostages. So when you open Daniel chapter 1 and you meet these Israeli teenagers at the court in Babylon, you need to recognize that they're hostages brought back to Babylon to assure that the Judeans back in Jerusalem don't try anything tricky. They're 1,000 miles away and months separated in terms of an army being able to get there. Michael?
Is Josiah the good king?
Josiah is the last good king.
And he, they said that he, although he brought the nation back, there was just too much blood from the nation previously, and God said, "You're doing a good job, but I have to do my wrath against the nation, and I'm going to take you out of the way so you won't see all the destruction that's done." Is that, and I am interpreting
No,
that
yeah,
right?
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Josiah's father was Manasseh,
Who is loud.
who was the most evil king in the history of both the northern and the southern kingdoms, who sacrificed his own children to the god Moloch. And the way they sacrificed children was just absolutely barbaric. And the scriptures say that Manasseh filled the streets of Jerusalem with innocent blood. And even though the nation, there was at least a superficial repentance under Josiah, God said, you have broken the covenant, the penalty clause is going to be executed. And Josiah was taken out of the way, so he didn't see it, the execution. So here's a map, and get my laser pointer here. All right, so I go back down, I think I'll do mine. So over here we have Babylon, over on the lower right. And Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father, was crowned king of Babylon in 626, I think it was. The Medes and the Persians and the Babylonians were able to capture the city of Nineveh, and I think it was 612 BC. Then Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar was able to defeat the Assyrian army at Haran in 609 BC. And then this battle of Carchemish, if you want to read about the history of, just Google Carchemish. It's a famous battle. It changed the course of world history. And so Nebuchadnezzar and his allies were able to defeat the remnants of Assyria and the Egyptian armies at Carchemish in 605. So this over here you see the path of the Egyptian army headed toward Carchemish to join with the Assyrians. And here at Megiddo is where they battled Josiah and thoroughly routed the armies of Judah and killed King Josiah. And then they put a Egyptian puppet on the throne. And then when Nebuchadnezzar chases them back into Egypt, on the way back out, he replaces the Egyptian puppet with a Babylonian puppet. Okay. So this is in 605 BC. And then Nebuchadnezzar returns back around. This is called the Fertile Crescent, up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and then back down in Egypt. This is called the Fertile Crescent, and carrying all the way back around. So this is desert, the Arabian desert here in the middle. So you don't try to cross the desert. You can't do it. So it's 1,000 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem. Okay, so they carried Daniel away as a hostage back to Babylon. Now, 605, Daniel and the other hostages arrive in Babylon to begin training as functionaries under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now in 597, Jehoiakim, who was supposed to be the Babylonian puppet, conspired with the Egyptians to rebel. Bad move. And the prophet Jeremiah, when you read the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, don't do it. It's a mistake. He called Egypt a broken reed, which when you lean on it will break and will pierce your palm. But they rebel. And so King Nebuchadnezzar comes back, besieges Jerusalem, defeats the armies, puts another puppet king on, Zedekiah, and takes Ezekiel and another group of hostages back. So Daniel and his friends go back in 605. Ezekiel and his colleagues, his compatriots, go back in 597. Well, more plotting. 588, Zedekiah rebels. Nebuchadnezzar comes back and says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. There's not going to be a third time. Yeah. So in 586, Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem completely, burns the temple to the ground, takes everybody that's left alive except for the very poorest people in the land, and takes them back to Babylon. And Jerusalem is just ruins, and the temple is just a charred ruin. And he strips all the gold. He takes all of the golden vessels from the temple back to Babylon. So this occurs during Daniel's service to the king of Babylon in Babylon. So Daniel's probably about 15 or 16 in 605. So he's in his mid-20s. Yeah, he's in his 30s and serving. By the time the nation is completely obliterated in 586, yet he continues to faithfully serve Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. And we see within Daniel the prophecy of the fall of Babylon, the rise of Persia, and Daniel lives to see that carried out. So I'll close with this slide. Expect as we go through Daniel, and make note of it when it hits you. Okay, God is in control of history. History is not out of control. God is not reverting to plan B. God has a plan, and he is executing that plan, and it will be fulfilled. We're going to see the broad outline of the rest of history, including the point where we're at today, revealed in the book of Daniel. Probably the most famous prophecy in Daniel is the date of the coming of Christ, which is in chapter 9, the existence of a gap between his first coming and his second coming, and key characteristics of the Antichrist. We will see rises from the remnants of the fourth empire that's revealed, and that's the Empire of Rome. And in that portion, Daniel will predict the end of the Gentile domination over Israel, which then implies the establishment of the millennial kingdom, which was revealed in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So let me close here. I hope you're motivated to get into the book of Daniel. The Rhodes book is great. It is available on Kindle. We've still got a few more copies of the paperback. And if you need, you can also get it on Kindle for, I think it's pretty close to the same price, if I remember. Anybody have a final thought or comment before I close? Michael?
Do you think that Daniel was told by God in really clear fashion, keep on serving Nebuchadnezzar no matter what?
I have to assume that's the case because, Daniel remained loyal to Nebuchadnezzar all the way down to the end, and even to his grandson Belshazzar. So even though by the time we meet Nebuchadnezzar's grandson Belshazzar,
It doesn't clearly say that, it's implied.
it's implied.
Okay, that's.
Yeah. And Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Belshazzar's mother, praises Daniel to Belshazzar. So, all right. Let me close for us. Father, I'm reminded of your son's statement to the disciples that because they were his friends, he was going to tell them what he was going to do. And when I read the book of Daniel and you reveal to us the course of our history, it just reminds me that that you consider us your friends. And we are astounded by that because we know ourselves to be sinners. We know that we have never lived up to the greatest commandment, to love you with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength. And we have never lived up even to the second commandment, to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And yet you have made us righteous in the blood of Christ. And you've given us a heart by which we desire to please you and become more like your Son as you work in our lives. So, Father, open your word to us. Open the eyes of our hearts that we might see you more clearly and serve you more faithfully. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week, and we'll do Daniel chapter 1. And